So if my insulin pump just beeped, not good. High blood sugar. Anyway, I am back. I wish I'd known years ago that I could put a buttonhole in nearly any piece of clothing for my insulin pump. This would have saved so many problems over the years. I'm type 1 diabetic, and I've been wearing an insulin pump since college, and let me tell you, I've been snagged on the dishwasher, I have been caught dancing when I'm dancing with someone and their fingers stick on the tubing, my pump has fallen out during class. In the past, I am no longer in class, and clanged on those loud metal legs of desk chairs. My rings have caught on my insulin pump tubing when I'm waving my hands around. There have just been so many issues with my insulin tubing sticking up over my pants and going into my pocket. One tiny buttonhole would have saved me all of those snags. Hello, I'm Christine. I'm a sewist, I'm a card maker, and I'm usually doing both. Normally I like to post content more on the artsy craftsy side, but today I'm getting very, very practical because I think it's really important to know how to design around any little issues you may have. And the benefit of sewing is you can absolutely do this. When I first started sewing a little over a year ago, I knew instantly that I would be putting little buttonholes in every pocket I made just to make sure that my insulin pump tubing could go through any pocket. I did not know at the time that this was called adaptive sewing, which is basically sewing around any kind of medical need or any other differently abled need you may have. In this video, I'm going to talk about a few different fixes, including a hand-sewn hole you can do on any pair of clothing you have right now without a machine. I'm going to talk about a cleaner machine-sewn buttonhole. I'm also going to talk about waistbands and how you can insert a pocket for your insulin pump to go in a waistband. And I'm going to leave you with a question that I would love you to answer for me. I still haven't figured it out. This is the third video in my all sewing series. In the first one, I talked about sewing skills and wisdom I wish I'd known when I'd started. In my second, I talked about designing a coat to meet my celebrity crush. And in this one, I want to get really specific for anyone out there who might need some adaptive sewing inspiration. And if you're type 1 diabetic, I've got you. To date, I've sewn 3 different garments that I've specifically designed with adaptive sewing for insulin pumps in mind. I'm going to share some tips and struggles I had along the way so that you can know them up front. The first piece I designed with a buttonhole was a gathered skirt, and that was actually the very first piece I ever made. The second piece was a pair of pants with a tailored waistband, and the third piece was a knit jumpsuit. And I've learned that even if a pattern doesn't necessarily include a pocket, you can usually sneak one in there, and who doesn't want a pocket in their skirt? I certainly want 2 of them. First, I want to cover how you can right now get a needle and thread and sew your own buttonhole in a piece of clothing you already own. Ideally, this piece of clothing has some structure to it, like jeans, definitely a woven fabric. I would not do this on a knit, at least not for the first time around. Before I started sewing, I did actually cut holes in pockets of clothing that I had because, like, who's gonna see it? It's on the inside of a pocket, who cares? But I learned the hard way that, especially if it's a knit, if you cut a hole in the pocket, that hole is going to expand because it needs reinforcement. Today I'm showing you a pair of jeans I worked on. These are jeans I wear out dancing all the time, and I can't tell you how many times I've been dancing and someone sticks their finger in the wrong spot, gets caught on my insulin pump, and then in the middle of a great song I have to explain what is an insulin pump, what is type 1 diabetes, what is an autoimmune disorder. It all just kind of ruins the mood for me, and frankly, I don't know how much they want to know in the middle of a dance about an insulin pump. For this pair of jeans, I figured out exactly where I wanted the hole to be, and I could have put it up above where the fabric was exposed, but I wanted it just beneath, just to cover my bases. So I marked exactly where I wanted the hole to be, and then I measured my insert, and I marked a line just a little bit wider than the insert, which in this case was 1 inch. That will become the cut line of this buttonhole. Then I drew a little box about 1/8 of an inch maybe wider than the cut line, and the first step was to sew a reinforcing backstitch along that box line. Once I felt good about the reinforced backstitch, I grabbed my very, very sharp pair of scissors, which I recommend any sewist have even if you don't have a machine. The last step is to sew a buttonhole stitch around the backstitch line and enclosing the raw edges of the fabric, and now you've got a buttonhole in your jeans. If you want a really in-depth video about how to do all the stitches, including backstitch and the buttonhole stitch, check out the video that I linked below. Now, rather than connecting my pump and putting it into my pocket with the insulin tubing over my waistband, I can put the tubing through the buttonhole and connect directly to my port. If you're designing this buttonhole from scratch, it gets even cleaner and easier to do since you'll be working with just a flat piece of fabric, and you'll be able to iron on interfacing, which gives the buttonhole even more stability. So for the first garment I sewed, which was this Brumby skirt, I made a practice garment, also called a muslin, and it was really great to make a muslin for this skirt because I learned that I made the buttonhole a little bit too high on the pocket, and I didn't want it exposed to the public. Now, whether you want your buttonhole showing up or not, it's up to you, but I wanted the buttonhole below the exposed part of the pocket. And so when I made my practice garment, I saw once it all lined up that it was above the spot that I wanted it to be, so I was able to fix it in the next version. You also want to make sure that if you're sewing a buttonhole in a pocket, that it clears the seam allowance, because basically your pocket's going to be just a flat piece of fabric if you're designing a garment from scratch. And that flat piece of fabric includes seam allowance all around it. And if you go too low on the pocket, your button could be interfering with the seam allowance, which in that case, it's not gonna work because your buttonhole will basically be sewn into the seam allowance and you won't be able to access it. So I would say, if possible, construct either your pant leg or your skirt. Construct most of it before you need to insert the pocket, and then when it's time to add the pocket, you can lay it out and see where the seam allowance is going to go. It's just easier to visualize if you've got part of the garment constructed and then you're figuring out the pocket. In any case, just make sure it's not in your seam allowance. Now, when I created a buttonhole in this knit garment, which was a super cute jumpsuit, I learned a different lesson. Because this jumpsuit is a knit fabric, it needed extra reinforcement when I did the buttonhole, because without interfacing, which gives a garment more structure, if you put the fabric under the presser foot and start sewing the buttonhole, because knits are so unstable, the buttonhole is not going to sew cleanly and you might end up getting your fabric munched into your machine. Since I'm using an older buttonholer attachment that kind of rattles and, I don't know, it feels like the earth is going to shake beneath me when I'm creating a buttonhole, I always do a test fabric to make sure that the buttonhole sews as it's designed. Buttonholes are notoriously finicky on whatever machine you're sewing on, so make sure you do a test piece of fabric. When I was doing my knit jumpsuit test fabric, the machine completely munched up my fabric and it was just a total disaster. I had forgotten to interface the piece of test fabric, so I tried another one that was interfaced and that solved the problem. Another thing you can do to make sure you've got clearance on your insulin pump is to design a pocket in a waistband. And I took inspiration from a piece of exercise clothing that I have. It's actually a knit, and it has a tiny little hidden pocket in the waistband. And I thought, well, I could create that in a piece of pants that I create. So that is what I set out to do on these fun snakeskin cigarette pants. And in this case, for the practice garment, I made the waistband a little bit narrower than it should have been. I wanted the insulin pump to lie horizontally rather than vertically in the waistband because I didn't want too big of a waistband. But when I wore the muslin around for a bit, I learned that the pump just was not stable enough in there, and if I sat down and moved around, the insulin pump just popped out. So for the final garment, I just added length to the waistband and made it wider. And while I love this pair of pants and I think it fits really well, the waistband is just not sitting in the spot that I want it to be. It's up a little too high. I'm okay with it being really wide, but I wish it were lower. So I would say if you've sewn a muslin and it doesn't work for pants, consider sewing a second practice garment. I know they take forever, but I wish I had done it because ultimately you live with the final product. And if you're gonna live with something, especially something you've spent some money on the fabric on, you want it to be the way you want it to be. In terms of how I designed this hidden insulin pump pocket, it was pretty simple. You've got your main waistband and then you just add kind of a second strip of fabric and then you sew the second strip of fabric onto the waistband and you've basically got a hidden insulin pump pocket. So the workaround I would love to figure out next, and I don't know if there is one, but I used to wear these really cute bandage dresses out dancing, and if you've ever worn a bandage dress, you know they're skin tight and there's not much room to hide an insulin pump. And I used to put a clip on my bra and put the insulin pump there, but at one event at like 4 in the morning, the pump overheated and I had to call tech support and they were like, like, where was the insulin pump? And I was like, why do you need to know? And anyway, you have to tell tech support anything if your insulin pump breaks. And I don't want that happening anymore. I haven't worn a bandage dress since. So if you... Speaking of, my insulin pump just beeped. Not good. High blood sugar. But basically, that brings us to the end of this video, and what an appropriate ending that was. I hope you were able to take away some value. Let me know in the comments if this was useful, not useful. I actually got a comment the other day on one of my shorts that said, "This is the worst short YouTube has ever fed me," and that's saying something. It's all good in the end, all good attention. So please feel free to leave a comment either to balance that one out or chime in agreement. And if you liked this video, please like this video. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider subscribing. Hit the bell notifications to stay up to date when I publish a new video. And I will see you next time. Happy sewing!